In this explainer, we're cracking open a really core mystery of neuroscience. How does your brain build a stable, predictable reality from a world that is anything but?
So let's start with a really simple question. Why does coffee always smell like coffee? I mean, think about it. Whether you're catching a faint whiff from across the room or taking a deep breath right over the cup, your brain just goes, yep, that's coffee. But the actual signal your nose is getting, it's wildly different in those two moments. So how on earth does the brain pull off this magic trick?
And this is the heart of the problem, right here. The sensory signal itself is super unstable. A faint scent might activate just a few specific receptors in your nose, but a strong scent, it activates those plus a whole bunch more, creating a much bigger, noisier signal. And yet, your perception, your conscious experience of that smell, it stays incredibly stable. This isn't just a weird quirk, it's a fundamental puzzle of how we perceive anything.
To solve it, we're going to follow the clues just like the scientists did. We'll start with the puzzle itself, then trace the signal through two key brain regions. We'll find the mechanism that actually stabilizes it, and then, this is the cool part, we'll see how scientists proved their case with a really elegant experiment. And finally, we'll zoom out and see how this isn't just about smell, but about memory itself. You know, this mystery of perceptual stability is a challenge for all of our senses. Think about recognizing a friend's face in a dimly lit room, or trying to understand a word that someone's shouting across a noisy street. Our brains have to create a reliable, consistent perception from information that is often partial, messy, or just plain noisy. Smell just happens to be a fantastic system for digging in and studying how the brain does it.
So the scientists started by tracking that odor signal as it travels from the nose deep into the brain. They really focused their investigation on two critical areas, basically the first and second stops on the signal's journey. Let's see what they found.
Okay, first stop is the olfactory bulb, or the OB. You can think of it as the brain's first responder to any smell. Now, when scientists looked at the neural activity here, they found a surprise. Even under normal conditions, the signal was pretty variable. But when they used anesthesia, which kind of degrades sensory input, the signal in the OB just became a total mess of noise. The brain's initial picture of the smell completely fell apart.
But then they looked at the next stop, the piriform cortex, or PCX. And this is where things get really wild. Even though the input coming from the olfactory bulb was a complete mess, the representation of the odor in the PCX was still clear, robust, and totally stable. The PCX was somehow cleaning up that noisy signal it was receiving and generating a perfect, consistent picture of the smell. So the key takeaway here is that the magic is happening in the piriform cortex.
I mean, this discovery was huge. The PCX is the stabilizer. So the next logical step for the researchers was to figure out how, what circuit, what mechanism inside the piriform cortex is responsible for creating this stable perception from such an unstable input. And this filtering ability was incredibly robust. It didn't matter if the signal was weak because of anesthesia or chaotic because of a huge blast of a concentrated scent. The piriform cortex always managed to produce a clean, stable pattern. The question was no longer where the stabilization happens, but how it was doing it. The next big clue came from looking even closer inside the PCX itself. Turns out it has two main types of neurons doing the work. First, you've got semilunar cells. They only get input from the olfactory bulb. And their response? Well, it was just as unstable as the OB signal. But then there are the pyramidal cells. These guys get input from the OB and they connect to each other. And their response? Rock solid, stable. This was the smoking gun. It's not the cells themselves, but the connections between the pyramidal cells.
So this network of interconnected pyramidal cells became the new focus. The hypothesis was that these connections form a kind of echo chamber that can amplify and sustain a signal, essentially turning a messy whisper of an input into a clear, confident shout.
This is a concept called recurrent circuitry. Just imagine a few people in a huge crowd starting a chant. They get their neighbors to join in, who get their neighbors to join in, and pretty soon the entire section is chanting loudly and perfectly in unison. That's pretty much what these recurrent connections do. They allow neurons that are only weakly activated by an input to excite each other, rapidly amplifying a very specific pattern of activity.
So how does this chant create a stable perception? It's this brilliant four-step process that basically acts as a filter over time. First, the earliest, cleanest signals from the nose arrive and activate just a few key neurons.
Second, these neurons use their connections to get all their neighbors chanting, and they rapidly amplify that initial signal. Third, and this is the really clever part, that powerful chant triggers a wave of inhibition across the whole area. It's like a referee blowing a whistle to silence the crowd. And fourth, because the whole system is now inhibited, any of the later, noisier signals that arrive are simply ignored. The first clear signal wins, and all the noise gets locked out.
It's a beautiful theory, but, how do you actually prove it? To get the smoking gun, scientists needed to do something pretty radical. They needed to break the circuit and see if that stability just disappeared.
And what they did was just brilliant. They used a modified tetanus toxin to surgically silence the communication between the pyramidal cells. Now, this didn't stop the cells from getting the initial signal from the olfactory bulb, but it completely stopped them from talking to each other. It broke the echo chamber. It turned off that recurrent circuitry. And the result? Exactly what the theory predicted. This chart shows the ability of a computer to identify an odor across different concentrations. In a normal, control brain, the accuracy is super high. But in the one where the recurrent circuit was broken, the accuracy just plummeted. The piriform cortex completely lost its ability to stabilize the signal. It became just as noisy and unreliable as the olfactory bulb. This was the smoking gun.
So the case is pretty much closed on how we recognize a smell. But the implications of this mechanism go way, way beyond the nose. What we've just uncovered is actually a fundamental process of how the brain works.
This ability to take a partial, noisy, or degraded piece of information and reconstruct a full, stable pattern is called pattern completion. And it's not just for perception, it's one of the most fundamental features of how our memory works. Recurrent circuits, just like this one, are thought to be the very bedrock of our ability to recall memories.
And you use this pattern completion all day, every single day. When you recognize a friend's face from a grainy photo, that's your brain completing the pattern from a partial cue. When you understand a whole sentence, even though you might have misheard a word, that's pattern completion. And when a single smell or just a snippet of a song suddenly brings back a full, vivid memory from your childhood, that is this exact same recurrent circuitry, this same echo chamber in action. And that leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. We don't just passively receive reality. Our brain is constantly actively reconstructing it based on noisy and incomplete data. It's filling in the gaps, stabilizing the picture, completing the pattern. So the real question is, how much of what we experience as objective reality is actually just a beautiful and incredibly convincing reconstruction? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me.